Science is perhaps the best set of ideas that humanity has come up with. It's certainly a methodology, the fruits of which underpin our modern society. We wouldn't have the society we have today if it wasn't for science. We wouldn't have computers and mobile phones, we wouldn't have vaccines, we wouldn't have air travel. All of the things that make our society work today are the fruits of science. And therefore, it's only fair to ask, what role should science have in developing policy and in developing social attitudes across our society? Is science is preeminent in the debate? Does it have a front row seat in deciding what we should be doing on particular issues with the environment, with our society, and with politics? Or is science just another voice in the policy debate? We have four brilliant minds to discuss this tonight. Please, ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Ted Brown, Emeritus Professor of Chemistry at the University of Illinois, David Castle, Professor and Chair of Innovation in the Life Sciences at the University of Edinburgh, Christian List, Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at the London School of Economics, and Rosemary Lister, the inaugural Professor of Climate and Environmental Law at the University of Sydney. I'm going to start from right down the other end of the table. Rosemary, in our modern society, science does have an important role to play. But what is that role, and how should that be acknowledged by the people who are running the society?
First of all, I want to say that as a lawyer, in order to prepare both for this panel and for the conference, I've done a lot of reading, of course, outside of the area of law. And I guess that the interesting thing is that it's challenged me to think myself about what is the role of law, because as an environmental lawyer, I'm acutely conscious of the fact that science has always been relied upon by policymakers and by regulators in order to make legislation, regulations, and it's also heavily relied upon in the courts in order to adjudicate between disputes. But I've had to think a little bit more broadly about the role of science in society beyond law. And I think that there are a number of points that I came across in my research. And the first is that really society expects science to be able to adjudicate between competing claims to truth. So scientists are supposed to get the evidence, they're supposed to test that evidence during the process of peer review, and they're supposed to be able to distinguish for themselves, but for our sake, between fact and error. And I think that in climate change, it's very apparent that there's a body of peer-reviewed science which is counterpoised by climate skeptics. So that's one role, adjudicating between competing claims to truth. The second one that we really do expect of scientists is that they can make robust statements about the likelihood of certain future physical events occurring. And that is, of course, what we want scientists to tell us about climate change. But we want those statements to be robust. And thirdly, I think what we expect from scientists is that they make definitive statements. So we want their statements to be definitive, we want them to be universal, and really we want them to tell us as members of society what is and what is not dangerous. So in other words, we're expecting scientists to make certain normative statements about the world and about how the world should be. But I'm not sure, from all of the reading that I've done, and of course scientists will be in a better position to answer this, whether that is what society expects of scientists and whether in fact scientists are capable of living up to and delivering on all those three particular demands. And I guess certainly from the perspective of an environmental lawyer and with my interest in climate change, there's this whole area of uncertainty. And scientists, to my surprise, are quite nonchalant. They are quite accepting of the fact that their outcomes will have a range of uncertainties. I remember the first science law conference that I ever went to, and the scientists said, we expect a range of uncertainty of between 5 and perhaps 20%. And I was horrified. I had no idea. And I think that from a public policy perspective, this nonchalance about uncertainty is something which is quite challenging for regulators. And it's also challenging for us as general members of the public, because we know scientists are telling us that there is uncertainty, but we don't really know where that is, and policymakers find it hard to respond in the context of uncertainty. But I think this uncertainty is quite normal for science, and yet perhaps the public and policymakers regard this uncertainty as the anomaly, because we want certainty and we want definitive statements.
Christian, does the public actually understand science? I mean, if they are after definitive answers, then surely they don't understand the way that science operates.
Well, whether the public understands science or not depends obviously on the level of information, education, public relations that is being done by scientists and the education system more broadly. But I'd like to say a little bit about how one might view the relationship between science and decision-making. And I'll begin just with a very simple point about individual rational choice. When we as individuals make decisions, these depend first of all on our desires or preferences or fundamental values or goals, what we want to achieve, but they also depend on our beliefs or information. Even in a very simple example, if I have a desire to drink coffee and I have a belief that there is coffee available next door, then I make the decision to go there expecting the outcome of getting the coffee. So now this picture of putting beliefs and desires together in order to make rational decisions applies not just to individuals in day-to-day contexts, but it also applies to society at large. And of course, society at large makes much bigger decisions than individuals, and the actions that we take as a society have potentially very far-reaching consequences, sometimes very good ones, sometimes very catastrophic ones. Now, how can we think of science in this regard? Well, we could think of science as society's best shot at having a belief formation module. Just as we individuals want to be able to form reliable beliefs in making our individual decisions about mundane day-to-day matters, so society, in making its rather more grand decisions, also needs a reliable belief formation module in order to achieve whatever values we might democratically choose to pursue. And so then the big question is, how can we as a society make our decisions rationally based on, first of all, our values and goals, but also our best informed beliefs? And it seems that the type of democracy that we find in many countries, which is sometimes characterized as a purely aggregative democracy, is not perfectly well suited for this job. So in a purely aggregative democratic system, we basically just ask people, what are your preferences over these different policies or options, not paying attention to the beliefs at all on the basis of which those preferences are formed. And so many political theorists, political philosophers these days are advocating a more deliberative form of democracy in which much more emphasis is placed on information, discussion, deliberation under civil and well-informed conditions, so as to basically improve the belief formation module that then feeds into the way preferences are arrived at and then fed into the political process. And I think in answer to your question that you raised, we shouldn't underestimate ordinary people's capacity to arrive at well-informed judgments, when they actually are given the time, information, and opportunity to reflect or deliberate about these issues. And so just very briefly, I've been involved in a research project with a group of people in the United States called deliberative polling. This is led by someone called Jim Fishkin at Stanford. And in these deliberative polls, ordinary people, basically a random sample from the general population is chosen. Initially, they are interviewed on some controversial political issue with broad implications, just like as in any ordinary opinion poll, but then they are brought together for a weekend of group deliberation in which they are given information materials, they listen to the views presented by competing experts, the panels are put together in a fairly balanced and broad way, and then they are asked again how their opinions have changed. And it actually seems, based on the evidence that we have from these deliberative polls, that the opinion even of such a very broad cross-section of the population who previously perhaps have not had much exposure to science or to this form of fairly rational deliberation in this highly formalized setting, those opinions tend to become by and large much better informed and much more aligned perhaps also with the kinds of recommendations that scientists would make on some of these issues. So I think there is hope for successful democratic decision-making if only we get our act together and somehow manage to make our democracies a little bit more deliberative. So we shouldn't be too cynical about the population at large.
David, the role of science here, it could be seen as just another set of ideas to throw into the melting pot, and out the other end, when you throw in other contributions from religion and from law and other social and political influences, out comes the sausage at the end that is the policy of how we will approach a problem. Is that an appropriate role for science, or does science require some kind of special pleading?
Well, as somebody who studied scientists for many years, I would actually describe scientists as a professionalized pleading class. But perhaps that's not quite the right way to start off an answer to your question. So let me
that sounds fine to me.
Let me start again. Well, let me just say initially here that my remarks are going to be conditioned by the fact that I've worked on agri-food biotechnology and ethics for the better part of a decade in Canada, having only recently moved to the UK. And also the way I tend to look at these sorts of questions is to think about them from the standpoint of one who's interested in science and technology innovation, which necessarily involves thinking things through in a kind of a systems perspective. So on the question of authority, which I think is what your question was alluding to, my general view is actually that the authority question comes up only when the word is used, and it invokes so many problematic associations, such as authority about what and whose authority, and ultimately what kind of authority. I sometimes wish that we could actually put the word authority and the phrase authority of science to one side and get on with other kinds of, I think, perhaps more serious questions, because I think that this use of this word, I think, tends to actually precondition our discussion in ways that are sometimes a little bit unfortunate. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think that science is in the business of asking and answering questions about the natural world, and as a source of knowledge and technique specific to that job, the implied expertise that goes along with it is something that we can speak about much in the way that we talk about architects or lawyers having professional competency. So I think where we get into trouble then with the authority question is when judgments about expertise are conflated with non-epistemic granting of privileged and perhaps unearned social status of scientific explanation and scientists' authority to be arbiters of truth and to make ultimate decisions. So there are no doubt cases where this in fact happens, and some of them are notorious and problematic. But I do find that the question, when we're focused on authority of science, to lead us into conversations of power dynamics and less what we can actually say reliably about the natural world. So where I think the issue of authority tends to arise is really mostly in contexts in which we actually have competing social interests, not necessarily competing views about what we think nature is. For example, risk assessments of genetically modified organisms are very interesting to study in this context, because the combination of factors going into the risk assessment often clearly leads to intended public policy outcomes. The science may actually still be pretty good, but the role it is expected to play shifts when it becomes a power broker. Perhaps then the necessary division is between the use of science, having it on tap, as Churchill said, rather than on top. One of the other reasons why I take a slightly deflationary view about authority and authority of science is that I would prefer to see an end to the last vestiges of the so-called culture wars or science wars, in which just calling into question science's authority gave the illusion that science's claim to its epistemic territory was somehow usurped. It may be true that public officials that they have to be recognized as such in order for them to be officials, but I think in the case of science, the arbiter is something else other than public recognition, something closer, I think, to truth, or whatever we're allowed to call it these days.
So, to Ted, what about in situations such as the climate debate, as it is at the moment? The climate debate wouldn't exist if it wasn't for science. We wouldn't know that there's a problem with the climate if it wasn't for the science understanding carbon dioxide, understanding the effects on the environment of land clearing and putting methane into the atmosphere, etc., etc., etc. So surely in a situation like that, the science should take some kind of orchestrating role in deciding what we do about it.
Yeah, the point that you make is I think, a very reasonable one about a topic as broad and as much in the public mind as climate change is. But, you know, that in terms of the epistemic issues related to climate change, those go back a long time. I mean, people in the 19th century were talking about the fact that the combustion of fossil fuels was going to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and could have the potential to raise the temperature of the Earth at the surface. Svante Arrhenius wrote on that subject, and people even before him. And I remember when I was a graduate student in the 1950s, I had a physics course from a man named Gilbert Ploss, whose research interest involved computing the envelope for carbon dioxide. These were pre-computer days. He was doing all of this by hand, and it was an awful calculation. But he basically was trying to calculate the absorptivity of carbon dioxide so that he could more accurately put that into the models that were present for estimating what the effect of the carbon dioxide would be on climate. So at that time, there wasn't a lot of social agitation about this subject. I mean, it was, however, perfectly clear that if we kept on burning all the fossil fuel we had, things were going to get warmer. I mean, no scientist, no physicist or chemist who looked at the problem in those days had any doubts about that. But once it became a sort of problem that rose to the level of visibility in the larger society, well, of course, it aroused a lot of other interests. Now the authority of science, if you want to talk about it that way, had to compete against other sources of authority. They weren't necessarily the same. They weren't epistemic sources, but they were sort of moral authority. What about the effects of all the jobs if we stop burning carbon dioxide? What's going to happen to our economy? You had all sorts of other shoulds working in consonance with, in some cases, and in opposition in other cases, to some of the suggested outcomes of burning fossil fuels as we have been doing. So I think that in a way, science's authority, if you'd like to talk about it, is sometimes forced upon it. And it isn't that scientists in particular are interested in exercising moral authority in the form of thou shalt, thou should do this, thou should not do that. It's simply their epistemic authority which promotes, or which leads them to some conclusions about the way the world is, and and those conclusions are out there for people to draw consequences from. They can imagine the inferences that can be made as to what might happen. We talk about climate change, and we can think of many other issues where there's a lot of uncertainty, perhaps, in the outcomes of the research that science has done. But people have to evaluate those in terms of other considerations than simply the scientific epistemic values that science puts forward. And this is a really complicated subject, and I hope to talk more about it tomorrow. I mean, my conviction is that we can't get away from using the word authority. It's if you put some other word in its place, it's going to come to mean the same thing. It's the process that we're talking about here. We make knowledge about the world, and we build that knowledge up to the point where we can make some use of it. We make projections on the basis of it, and so forth. And if those projections are in conflict with what some people with other issues and would have, we're going to end up with a conflict. And science can't avoid that kind of conflict. It simply has to deal with it, but it has to deal with it in an honest way by simply being sure about its epistemic values that it uses in the projections that it makes toward the society.
Rosemary, if I can come back to you, you mentioned that you were actually horrified when you realised that scientists were talking about uncertainty in the 5 to 20% area. And it actually touches on something that I regularly encounter, and that is that people's misunderstanding of science isn't so much in the facts that science produces, it's in the methodology. It's in the way that science operates, and people don't understand that. Can you...
Well, I'm one of those people who, until I tried to do a lot more reading around science, didn't really understand how science operated. And I think that one of the things that really does need to be communicated and to contribute to this deliberative democracy that we've been talking about is the scientific method. What exactly is peer review? And what is it as a methodology? What does it contribute to the science? Does it build consensus? How are questions of uncertainty answered? And I think that it's important because in the public debate there is this tendency to pitch peer-reviewed science against the comments of those other scientists who probably aren't climate scientists but who in any case are skeptical of the science. And so I think that if the public were able to understand the value of peer-reviewed science, then it would help in terms of understanding this notion of consensus. But I still think that the consensus is not going to give you the ultimate answer. That's what I think. I think that science is a process which is continuing to try to discover this truth.
Because if there's something that people seem to have even more problem understanding, it's that a scientific truth is provisional. It can change with new evidence, with a new approach, with a new methodology in that approach. People don't like that instability. Is there any way that we can get them to like it? Get them to understand that that's the way that science operates? Anyone? Would anybody like to tackle the job of trying to educate the public on why science is provisional and why we should embrace that? Christian, you look like you've got a thought bubbling away there.
I'm not sure I have an answer to this question, but I'd like to follow up on what you just said. I think often the process of scientific discovery and peer review is falsely presented as being somewhat elitist and an activity that is restricted to a very small, exclusive club of scientists. But nothing could be further from the truth, and I think this is something that ought to be communicated much better in education. In fact, scientific methodology is actually highly transparent, and something that I always try to explain to my students in introductory methodology classes is a remark that the philosopher W.V. Quine made when he described the activity of science as common sense gone self-conscious. And I think this is actually a very good description. When we try to do problem solving in ordinary contexts, we might do so by trial and error, for instance, and this is a methodology which is very easy to understand, even for a 5-year-old child in principle. And basically what science is just a highly coherent, procedural, stylized and sophisticated version of that very same methodology that even children adopt when they first explore the world and learn about it, except that once we generalize and extend this methodology beyond the individual and do this in a large community of people under very careful procedures with a lot of cross-verification, which is a key idea underlying peer review, then this methodology turns out to be an incredibly powerful generator of knowledge and insights about the world. And I think it's the continuity between common sense and science that should be communicated a lot more to make it clear that science is not at all elitist, but actually a very transparent activity.
And David, when it comes to getting the message across of how science operates, and that I like your idea of its common sense codified there, Christian. But it's still a complicated process to get across to the mind of a simple person like a politician who needs to think and act in sound bites. And added to that, we've got this situation in Australia, you have it in the United Kingdom at the moment, where the government is so finely poised electorally that there are no votes in science. There's no point in going into that territory. And so where I'm leading us to is science being excluded from the process politically because it's just too complicated and there's no votes in it.
I'd like to raise
yeah, please.
A comment about this notion about that the public really does understand how science works. It's not all that complicated and so on. I don't really think they do. I think that for many people, science is a big black box. I mean, there's something that goes on in there, and then every once in a while something leaks out. This is what science thinks about this or about that, And the processes by which something that could be called scientific opinion actually gets arrived at is not clear at all to people. And they don't understand, for example, to take the case of climate change, which we've been talking about. One of the best ways for those who are not interested in seeing anything happen in mitigation of fossil fuel combustion is to erase the idea that there is no consensus. That is, by finding some people, some skeptical scientists, some anti-establishment scientists to testify to the effect that these models aren't right and so forth and so on. These people may not have very much in the way of standing in the scientific community. A couple of years ago in the United States, there was one of these groups of people interested in diminishing the authority of science with respect to climate change, got something going, and they had something that was signatures of 32,000 people who were supposed to be climate scientists, all of who said this business about global warming is nonsense. Well, the 32,000 names consisted mostly of the names of local weathermen from all the TV stations all over the country, and every high school teachers of physics or whatever. I mean, when people can be confused in that respect, then the idea of science's authority, or the notion that there is a reliable consensus in science, becomes damaged, and science loses its authority or its capacity to convince people of how things should be. And so the very fact that people don't have a good idea of how science arrives at a sort of consensus view, that doesn't mean there aren't any holes in the arguments. It doesn't mean it's a solidly locked up case. It just means that for the moment, in terms of what we know, this is our best guess, and most of the people working in this field go along with that best guess. That's what consensus sort of means in a practical sense. People don't understand that. And so it's very easy to cause a lot of skepticism and indifference to scientific results by just simply attacking that notion of consensus.
So you raised the question about...
Is science too difficult for politicians, I think, is in a nutshell.
Right. I'll get to that one in a minute. I wanted to say something else, though, about this issue about uncertainty.
Politicians. This is very un-Australian.
Well, I'll make this remark brief then so we can get on to the meatier subjects. So the issue about uncertainty in science and decision-making in public policy is I don't think that the right way to go about this is, as you suggested, to whet everybody's appetite for uncertainty, because I don't think generally that's something that people who are otherwise turning to science for something a little bit more definitive will find satisfactory. But I think the reality of this is that there are many types of scientific uncertainty, and some of that scientific uncertainty is going to be enduring, because some problems may just be intractable or beyond the scope of time that we have to make decisions. And it means that sometimes the actual hard decisions, the things about which we have to say yes and no to, are public policy decisions that are based on evidence that is not as robust as we would like to have it. So this is not a diminishment of the authority of science. It's just to say that's the status of the evidence. Nevertheless, we have to make a decision. How close would you like your nuclear reactors to the ocean? Would you like to launch another space shuttle? These are the sorts of questions that people have to make definitive judgments on, even though the risk analyses are not, properly speaking, executable, because you can't test them. You can't predict them until you've actually got some of these negative results in, like we currently have in Japan and we've had with space shuttles in the past. So the problem is that we have hard decisions to make using soft science. And I think that that's actually the right way to cast scientific uncertainty, not as a problem that people need to like, or a problem that's internal to science and we need to fix, but that I think we need to actually start to have a more honest look at what we actually do in public policy, which is that we actually make decisions about values that connect up to evidence that comes from science, and those decisions are not actually themselves based entirely on science. And so there's a corresponding mistake here then, to expect that you can actually get public policy decisions about what you think is right or wrong for the future of your society from scientists whose job it is to actually figure out how the natural world ticks. Their job is not actually to come up with careful calculations in the public interest about what the right or wrong decision is. To the extent that there is a role for science in policy, it's to feed forward, I think, the best evidence and to be frank about the uncertainties associated with it. Now, back to this issue about scientific literacy. It is a problem that elected officials, by and large, do not have much in the way of knowledge, experience, academic background with natural science. This is something that we've certainly noticed in the Canadian context, where we did a calculation over several governments, and it came out to something in the order of about 85% at a minimum of parliaments were formed by people who had law degrees but hadn't actually even practiced law for more than a decade. So in fact, it was very interesting to see that people were making quite long-lasting and significant decisions in the Canadian context about, say, assisted human reproduction and passing acts without actually really understanding the difference between hybrids and cybrids and knowing all of the sort of basic terminology and understanding the basic biology. And we've spent some time trying to remedy this situation. Where you actually do see traction with science, though, is in civil service. And I think it's actually the layer between elected officials and civil servants that you really need to actually see a proper translation of science, so that many civil servants actually have quite a high degree of expertise with respect to science for policy and science for regulation, and are quite abreast of current science. But there's a problem there where those two houses of government actually don't meet smoothly. It's often with a lot of friction over policy issues. But that's a matter internal to government that I think we need to actually talk about more publicly, rather than just beating up on elected officials for not knowing enough about science.
Christian, there's an idea out there in society that science literacy among the populace is a good thing. No one's quite sure what level of science literacy, no one's quite sure what you actually mean by science literacy, but that the population should understand something about how science operates and some basic scientific concepts. Is that really such a worthwhile aim? I mean, we don't have campaigns for accountancy literacy or legal literacy or any of the other disciplines. Why should science literacy be seen as important? Or should it be seen as important?
Well, it depends a little bit on which aspects of science literacy we want to emphasize here. So we certainly rely on a division of labor in society, and it's just not feasible for everyone to be an expert on everything. So the idea that everyone could be well informed about absolutely every aspect of science is completely utopian and also unnecessary. But I think the one aspect of science literacy that does matter is communicating to the public through education and in other ways a better understanding of and appreciation for the scientific method. Once again, to reinforce the earlier point, to make it clear that scientific findings are not merely the pronouncements of some elite, but that they are actually arrived at through a particular reliable method, which is not totally obscure. Once one has appreciation for that method in principle, it becomes also much easier to recognize the epistemic authority of scientists in a particular area as being legitimate. I mean, once I know enough about how, for instance, peer review works and how the scientific community operates, I, as a layperson in most sciences, still have reasons to tentatively accept the latest findings published in Nature and Science this week. They are no longer obscure to me, even though I myself may not know all the details of all of this, but it's nonetheless transparent to me that if I or someone else like me were to spend enough time studying these issues, there would be a transparent step-by-step process by which one can conclusively arrive at these findings. And I think it's this aspect of the transparency of the scientific methodology that needs to be communicated, at least in principle. And just to clarify, I mean, I'm not suggesting that right now the status of the scientific methodology is generally well understood. All I'm advocating is that we place more emphasis in science education on making the nature of the science methodology known.
Yeah. I wanted to comment on 2 points that have been made. First of all, about the understanding of science within the administration or within the bureaucracy. And from a legal point of view, I think it's important to understand that if decisions are made, administrative decisions are made, that are not based on rational evidence, it's actually unlawful. And that's why I was saying that it's when matters come before the court, disputes about whether or not development consent should have been given in an area which we know will be subject to increased flooding because of climate change, well, then the question very much is whether or not the decision maker took into account relevant information. And so it's important in terms of rational decision making, but I think that scientific literacy in the public must go some way towards this whole question of rational deliberation as well, getting back to the point of deliberative democracy, because I think that's sort of seen as a preferable way of approaching problems than interest group pluralism, where everyone's just horse trading. So rather have society understanding and deliberating. But then my question is, where does the public, if we can define what that is, get its information from, so that it's able to engage in this process of rational deliberation? And I suppose that in some ways I'm looking at the role of the media. I mean, whose job is it to communicate what we've been talking about, the scientific method, what is the science on any issue? Who should be communicating that? For people who aren't accessing academic institutions, who aren't still in school, and so on.
Catalyst 8 o'clock, Thursday nights, your ABC.
Yes.
You're paying for it, folks, so you may as well watch it. Sorry, David?
I just wanted to add one thing to that, because I think your first point about the role of science in government with respect to liability is an interesting one, because in many jurisdictions, and I don't know the situation for Australia, but I would presume it's fairly similar to other parliamentary democracies that have common law, that you can't actually sue government for its policies. So they can have completely bizarre policies that are take evidence from all sources and be completely incoherent and inconsistent. But it's actually really in the operations of government and regulation that you have the government is held to an account with respect to its view on science. And I think that this is really quite interesting, because we oftentimes actually mix the science policy perspective that's promulgated by a government that is in power, which is actually quite different from the enacted statutes by which all governments are basically bound once they're into power. So they can say a lot of things about such things as climate change, but if there's science to show that they were negligent and that there's a statutory basis for negligence, then then they would actually indeed be in trouble. So there is a point at which, in government, science actually really is rubber that hits the road in the operations, and I think that that's actually quite important to distinguish, because I think in one important respect, it suggests that we actually overestimate the need to have elected officials know something about science.
I'd just like to wrap up. I'd just like to quickly go through the panel and ask, where's this discussion going to be in 5-10 years' time? Where's it heading? Rosemary, what do you see as the future of the role of science in policy making across society?
Well, I certainly think that it's going to continue to play a very important role, but I think we've already seen that it's not really the only expertise and the only voice that is important in policy making. And certainly I think that the voice which is gaining ascendancy with regard to responding to science is the voice of economists. So we've seen, I mean, if we just think about the public policy debate at the moment, people like Professor Ross Garneau, who has a very big and important role to play in terms of not only communicating economic responses to climate change, but who in fact also makes sure that he's communicating the science of climate change as well. So I think that it's not only going to be science that contributes to this, but there's no doubt that science isn't going to disappear, because it does provide us the basic evidence to which public policy needs to respond. And I think that we're seeing in environmental law quite a tension between scientists and economists who would propose market solutions to pollution, to allocating water, to dealing with biodiversity. So I think that we might see tensions developing between different disciplines.
What sort of future do you see, Christian?
Well, first of all, as I already indicated at the beginning, I would like to see democracies move in a more deliberative direction, and would welcome institutional reforms that encourage this move. But secondly, I would also like to echo these remarks about the relationship between science and economics. I think that one of the very nice features of the Stern Review on climate change was precisely that it brought together insights from natural science, from economics, and also from moral philosophy in addressing this issue. All too often, for instance, economic analysis of climate change takes place in a way that is too narrowly focused on very classical cost-benefit analysis without taking either the natural scientific or moral philosophical side into account. So in short, apart from a more deliberative form of democracy, I would certainly welcome more collaboration between scientists, economists, and philosophers in informing policy debates.
David, the future role of science in policy debate?
In 5 or 10 years, I think what we will be talking more about are ways of actually getting valuable impact from science and technology in short, medium term, and ways of actually demonstrating that you're getting that kind of impact, particularly for publicly funded science. I think we've come off of a couple of pretty good decades of increasing science budgets around OECD countries, where there's been a bit of an expansionist era, and certainly in the biological sciences, an era of what might be called discovery science. And I think that increasingly now for the next decade, we're going to be seeing funding tightening up and demands that it actually have practical utility rising. And I think that there will probably be a couple of catalysts there. One of them will be the final sort of big spurt in the growth of human population, even though the overall rates are declining. We'll see the last 2 billion added in the next couple of decades, coupled with the fact that now more than half of the world's people live in cities, is going to be producing, in conjunction with climate change, I think, unique dynamics around energy use and food, fiber, all of which are going to be coming into increasing conflict with one another. In my opinion, I think that the push for the next couple of decades is going to be show that science, in particular the biological sciences, can get its act together, produce a systems-oriented suite of solutions that will get us out of some, I think, fairly, what do you call it down here, sticky wickets?
Yeah, sticky wicket will do. Ted, the future of science and policy debate?
I quite agree with David's comments. I think that what impresses me is that when you put together the challenges that are before us because of the increasing number of humans on the planet, and also the drive for raising the standard of living in some places in the world where there are billions of people, we're headed for some terrible crises in terms of what resources we have and what uses we can make of them. And science is inevitably going to be drawn into those. It's not going to be a pretty time, and it's not going to be an easy time for science. It may be called to the table to say this or that, but it's not going to be an easy time for the scientists who have to make those judgment calls or give that advice. It's going to be a very tough world to negotiate.
Well, on those cheery notes, ladies and gentlemen, we've covered a very broad canvas tonight, and it wouldn't have been possible without 4 excellent minds at the front table. Please put your hands together for Professors Rosemary Lister, Christian List, David Castle, and Ted Brown. Thank you very much.